Okay, so Alison Boshoff has just gone there. The editor-at-large of the Daily Mail finally conceding that there are problems in Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's relationship. Now, I have obviously been reporting this now for media, in the Daily Mail in particular, which Prince Harry and Meghan Markle remain on a deranged campaign to shut down. To go there is highly significant.
Got Archie from this angle. You think, well, sooner or later, it's just by degrees, isn't it? And you think, why are we not being a little bit more binary?
There are moments in public life when the carefully constructed walls around a narrative begin to crack. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, inevitably, under the accumulated weight of evidence that can no longer be ignored. For months, perhaps years, the mainstream media had maintained a studied silence on certain aspects of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's life in California. Not because the questions weren't there.
What reports do you get about how the decline in the business is affecting the relationship? Do you know anything about that?
You hear different things from different people, but that is one of the things that you hear, is that there is tension over the children. And, she's, it's almost like...
Not because the signs weren't visible, but because the legal risk, the reputational exposure, and the sheer complexity of engaging with two of the most litigious public figures in modern British history made caution the default position of almost every major publication. And then, quietly but unmistakably, that silence began to break. The Daily Mail, one of Britain's most widely read and most legally cautious publications, a newspaper that Harry and Meghan had been waging what observers described as a deranged campaign to shut down, published a piece by its editor-at-large, Alison Boshoff, that crossed a line most mainstream outlets had refused to approach. It acknowledged, openly and on the record, that something was wrong, that tension existed, that the picture being presented to the public of a harmonious, purposeful, and thriving life in Montecito, California bore only a passing resemblance to the reality being described by sources close to the couple. It was, by any measure, a significant moment, and what it revealed went far deeper than a troubled marriage or a faltering brand. It revealed the anatomy of a collapse, systematic, accelerating, and increasingly impossible to conceal. The specific point around which Boshoff chose to anchor her report was, on its surface, a domestic one. It concerned the children, Archie and Lili, the son and daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, whose faces and identities had been the subject of sustained and deliberate management since the moment of their births. Harry had spoken publicly and repeatedly about his desire to protect his children from the intrusive media scrutiny that he believed had contributed to the death of his mother, Princess Diana. It was one of the most emotionally resonant arguments he had ever made. One that attracted genuine sympathy from people across the political and cultural spectrum, people who might otherwise have been deeply skeptical of his broader narrative. The protection of his children was the one area where Harry's stated motivations appeared unambiguously sincere, the one corner of his public persona that seemed to exist entirely outside the machinery of brand management and strategic positioning. And yet, according to Boshoff's reporting, it was precisely this area that had become a source of significant tension within the Sussex household. Because while Harry's commitment to protecting Archie and Lilibet from public exposure remained genuine and deeply felt, his wife's approach to the same question had been moving in a markedly different direction. Meghan Markle had returned to Instagram in 2025, and with that return had come a gradual but unmistakable escalation in the visibility of the couple's children on the platform. The escalation was subtle, designed, observers noted, to maintain plausible deniability about any deliberate strategy. A glimpse of a child from one angle, a partial face caught at the edge of a carefully composed image, a moment of apparent spontaneity that revealed just enough to feel intimate without technically crossing the line that Harry had publicly committed to. It was described by one observer as resembling a parlor game, a slow, incremental advance, each step small enough to seem innocuous, but each step moving consistently in the same direction. The cumulative effect was that the children's faces and identities, however carefully obscured in any individual image, were becoming progressively more visible to the public. The binary choice that Harry had always insisted upon, either the children were protected or they were not, had been replaced by something far more ambiguous, far more characteristic of the way the Sussex operation had always functioned. A confusing middle road that served the purposes of brand building while allowing its architects to deny that any line had been crossed. The irony of this situation was not lost on those who had followed Harry's public statements about his childhood.
Or just playing constant games. And Harry should know better. He should know better because I believe he's put more of a target on his children's backs when it comes to the media and the paparazzi because of these silly games.
And the trauma he attributed to media intrusion. He had spoken with considerable passion about the damage done to him by a press culture that he believed treated the children of the royal family as public property rather than human beings deserving of privacy and dignity. He had used that argument as a central pillar of his justification for stepping back from royal duties, relocating to America, and maintaining the sustained public campaign against British tabloid journalism that had defined much of his post-royal life. And yet here was his wife, deploying his own children as instruments of audience engagement on a social media platform, using them, in the view of many observers, in precisely the way that Harry had always claimed to find most objectionable. The tension this created within the Sussex household was, according to Boshoff sources, genuine and growing. Harry did not want his children used in this way, but the commercial pressures bearing down on the couple's operation had reached a point where Meghan's need to generate engagement, visibility, and the appearance of relatable domesticity had overridden his objections. His deepest personal conviction had been subordinated to the demands of brand maintenance, and the mainstream media, cautiously but unmistakably, was beginning to say so. But the tension over the children was, as Boshoff's reporting made clear, only the most emotionally charged symptom of a much larger and more structurally serious crisis. The commercial dimension of the Sussex collapse had been building for some time, documented in fragments across various outlets, but never assembled with the kind of comprehensiveness and sourcing that would allow the full picture to come into focus. What Boshoff achieved in her reporting was precisely that assembly, pulling together the strands of a story that, taken individually, might have seemed like isolated setbacks, but taken together revealed something far more definitive. The pattern of relationships destroyed, opportunities squandered, and alliances severed was not the result of bad luck or hostile media coverage or the machinations of an institution
but they are now
determined to undermine two
successful.
people
They
who
are
had dared to lead.
The stars of
It was
Hollywood
the result of
in
a
so many
consistent
ways. Lauren
behavioral
Sanchez
pattern
has also
that
been
had played
massively
out
successful.
across every
Snagged Jeff
significant professional
Bezos,
relationship
and Meghan
the
Markle is just
Sussexes
sitting there
had
with her
attempted to cultivate in America. And the consequences of that pattern had reached the point where the damage was no longer reversible through conventional means. The names on the list of alienated allies read like a map of American cultural power. Lauren Sanchez, media personality, philanthropist, and one of the most connected women in Los Angeles society, had distanced herself from the Sussexes following an episode that became known, in certain circles, as Photogate. The occasion was the 70th birthday party of Kris Jenner, matriarch of the Kardashian family, and one of the most formidable operators in the entertainment industry. The Kardashians have been among Meghan's most commercially significant allies in America, a family whose social media reach was so vast and so monetizable that their promotional support for Meghan's lifestyle brand, as ever, represented an extraordinary gift. The Kardashians had promoted Meghan's products to their combined audience of hundreds of millions of followers, effectively for free, at a time when the brand needed every advantage it could find. The value of that support, measured in conventional advertising terms, was incalculable, and Meghan had repaid it by making Kris Jenner's birthday party about herself, engineering a series of photographic moments that pulled media attention away from the host and redirected it toward the Sussexes. It was precisely the kind of social behavior that had preceded every previous breakdown in the couple's relationships with powerful figures, and it had the same effect. The Kardashian family withdrew. Lauren Sanchez, who had hosted the event and watched the spectacle unfold firsthand, withdrew. And two more doors, previously open, quietly closed. Anna Wintour, the legendary editor of Vogue, the most influential single figure in global fashion, and a woman whose approval represents the highest possible form of cultural validation in the world Meghan most desperately wanted to inhabit, had similarly created clear distance. The dynamics of their relationship had been visible in public for anyone paying close attention. At Paris Fashion Week, footage emerged of Meghan moving through the crowd with an entourage that witnesses described as being deployed in a manner that was less accompaniment and more enforcement. A physical apparatus designed to clear a path through the assembled guests until Meghan identified individuals of sufficient status to warrant a pause and the performance of warmth. When she encountered Wintour, the contrast was immediate and unmistakable. Wintour did not move toward her. She did not fall into step beside her. She maintained a deliberate and visible distance, a small gesture, but one that those familiar with Wintour's social codes understood immediately. It was a signal, and signals from Anna Wintour, in the world of fashion, carry the weight of edicts. Then there was Ari Emanuel, the founder and chief executive of Endeavor, arguably the most powerful talent agency in Hollywood, and a man whose ability to open doors, create opportunities, and shape careers was without equal in the entertainment industry. Emanuel had been a significant figure in the Sussex orbit, and his involvement, or the perception of his involvement, had lent the couple's American operation a credibility and a sense of strategic direction that was enormously valuable. But according to Boshoff's reporting, a specific incident had ended that relationship with a finality that left no ambiguity. The circumstances related to a period around Thanksgiving, during which Meghan's treatment of staff members had been described by sources as particularly difficult. Emmanuel, a man who had built an empire on his ability to read people and situations with ruthless accuracy, had made a decision. He washed his hands of the operation entirely. His name remained technically associated with the agency, but his personal involvement, the access, the relationships, the power that his direct engagement would have unlocked was gone. And with it went the strategic coherence that his presence had provided. The significance of losing Emmanuel as an active advocate could not be overstated, and Boshoff's reporting made this point with particular clarity. The entertainment industry in Hollywood operates almost entirely through personal relationships and the credibility that proximity to the right people confers. Without a powerful agent actively working on your behalf, making calls, attending meetings, attaching their reputation to your projects, the machinery of career advancement simply stops. The question of who was negotiating deals for Meghan, who was fielding approaches from producers, who was managing the relationship between her ambitions and the commercial reality of what the market would support, the answer, according to those familiar with the situation, was effectively nobody. She retained a lawyer, the same lawyer she had worked with before her marriage to Harry. But a lawyer and an agent serve fundamentally different functions. One protects, the other builds. And without someone actively building, what Boshoff described as momentum without direction became the defining characteristic of Meghan's professional life. Busy, active, highly visible in certain carefully managed contexts, and yet pointing nowhere. The directional confusion was evident to anyone examining the pattern of Meghan's public appearances and media engagements over the preceding months. 1 month she appeared on the cover of Harper's Bazaar, presented in the fashion context, with no mention of her lifestyle brand, no reference to her television work, no connection made to any coherent professional identity. The next month she was making a cameo appearance in an Amazon production, not as a fictional character, but as herself, a decision that one industry observer noted was not quite acting in any meaningful sense of the word. Then came a period of lifestyle brand focus, followed by a humanitarian posture, followed by a fashion moment, followed by attempts to position herself within the political sphere. Each iteration arrived with its own aesthetic, its own messaging, its own carefully assembled visual language, and each one departed before it had time to establish any lasting impression. Directors and producers, who had reportedly been described as eager to work with her, had not materialized into actual projects. An acting career that had been presented as imminent had produced no concrete evidence of its existence. A lifestyle brand that had launched with the full resources of Netflix behind it was described as still in test and learn mode, a characterization that, given the scale of the opportunity that had been squandered, one observer described as a euphemism of spectacular proportions. The financial reality underpinning all of this was, according to Boshoff's reporting, considerably more precarious than the couple's public profile suggested. The royal tours that Harry and Meghan had positioned as centerpieces of their humanitarian identity, the visits to Colombia, to Nigeria, to Australia, were not, as many had assumed, generating income that supported the couple's operation. They were, in fact, the opposite. According to information gathered by journalist Tom Bauer and referenced in Boshoff's piece, the Colombian tour alone had cost approximately $4 million to execute. Security, logistics, staffing, travel, the infrastructure required to mount what was essentially a private couple's version of a state visit consumed resources at a rate that bore no relationship to the income those tours generated. Harry's speaking fees, reported at around $50,000 per engagement, and Meghan's, estimated at significantly less, did not begin to approach the cost of the operation that produced them. The tours were, in the bluntest possible terms, loss leaders, and the question of who was absorbing those losses pointed toward relationships that were themselves beginning to show signs of strain. The role of George Soros's charitable foundation in underwriting some of the Sussex tour activity had been a matter of speculation in royal and political commentary circles for some time. If accurate, the scale of that underwriting, millions of dollars per tour, raised immediate questions about sustainability. Charitable foundations, however generously funded and however ideologically sympathetic to the Sussex's stated mission, are ultimately accountable to their own governance structures and their own assessment of return on investment. The question of what the Sussex tours were actually delivering, in terms of measurable impact, public awareness, policy change, or any other metric by which philanthropic activity is conventionally assessed, was one that had not been answered to the satisfaction of observers who looked closely at the available evidence. And if the answer was not satisfactory to external observers, it was unlikely to remain satisfactory indefinitely to the funders themselves. The Archwell Foundation, the charitable vehicle through which Harry and Meghan conducted their philanthropic activity, had itself come under increasing scrutiny. The pattern of engagement, latching onto existing causes, generating publicity around brief and high-profile interventions, collecting awards and recognition, and then moving on, had been documented across multiple charitable relationships. The Parents Network, assembled from families connected through various legal campaigns against social media companies, had been embraced with considerable fanfare, sustained for a period sufficient to generate positive coverage, and then quietly deprioritized once the publicity value had been extracted. The individuals involved, parents who had experienced genuine tragedy and who had sought genuine advocacy, had been used, in the view of critics, as material for the construction of a humanitarian image, rather than as partners in a sustained campaign for change. The Centerville situation was perhaps the most damaging illustration of this pattern. The charity, originally established in memory of Princess Diana and dedicated to supporting children affected by HIV in Southern Africa, had been shaken by a governance crisis that brought the underlying tensions of the Sussex charitable operation into stark relief. When the chair of the board, Sophie Shandoka, moved to introduce rigorous financial accountability measures, proper audits, transparent reporting of how funds were received and deployed, the response from those connected to Harry was to leave. Board members departed. The charity fell into disarray, and the departure of those who had been most loudly proclaiming their commitment to the organization's mission, at precisely the moment when that commitment was being tested by demands for financial transparency, told its own story. The original architects of the Invictus Games, the initiative that had perhaps done most to establish Harry's independent identity as a figure of genuine public value, were similarly distancing themselves. Sir Keith Mills, who had brought his experience from the Olympic Organizing Committee to bear on the Games' founding, was among those who had stepped back. The reasons offered were various, but the pattern was consistent. People who had come close to the Sussex operation, observed it from the inside, and then chosen to leave, were leaving in increasing numbers, and each departure took with it another fragment of the credibility that the couple had worked so hard to construct. The aspiration to philanthropy, to be seen, as Boshoff put it, as people of high moral rectitude and high value to the world, operating at something approaching a presidential level, was not in itself ignoble, but it rested on a foundational misunderstanding of what genuine philanthropy requires. Philanthropy, in its authentic form, is the deployment of personal wealth in service of public good. It is predicated on having wealth. It is predicated on giving that wealth away. It cannot be simulated by channeling other people's donations through a foundation and then distributing them in carefully staged public moments designed to maximize photographic impact. The performance of generosity is not generosity, and the gap between the performance that Harry and Meghan were staging and the substantive charitable impact that genuine philanthropy produces had become, in the view of an increasing number of observers, embarrassingly wide. What made the entire situation more tragic, more humanly compelling, and ultimately more difficult to look away from, was the evidence, fragmentary but persistent, that Harry himself was aware of all of this, that somewhere beneath the carefully maintained exterior of the Montecito life, beneath the Instagram moments and the speaking engagements and the humanitarian positioning, there existed a man who understood, at some level, that the path he was on was leading somewhere he had never intended to go. The People magazine profile that had been released to coincide with King Charles's American tour, timed, in the assessment of virtually every royal observer, as a deliberate attempt to divert media attention from a historic state visit, had contained, buried within its relentless positivity, a passage that said more than its authors had perhaps intended. It described Harry's desire for reconciliation with his family as genuine, ongoing, and emotionally significant. It described him as making small, manageable steps in that direction, with Meghan described as supportive. The language of small, manageable steps is not the language of confidence or momentum. It is the language of someone navigating a situation in which the larger resolution remains out of reach, and in which the possibility of that resolution is receding rather than approaching with every media intervention, every strategic profile, every carefully orchestrated moment of commercial positioning dressed as humanitarian purpose. The world that Harry and Meghan had tried to claim as their own, the world of celebrity, cultural influence, and commercial power, had looked at what they were offering and made its judgment. The judgment was not delivered in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of unanswered calls and unavailable meetings and quiet withdrawals by people whose presence would have meant something. It was delivered in the silence of Ari Emanuel's disengagement, in the deliberate distance of Anna Wintour's body language, in the pointed absence of the Kardashian endorsement, in the departure of board members and charity founders and original Invictus architects. It was delivered in the continued absence of the Netflix deal that was supposed to anchor the commercial operation, in the lifestyle brand still described as testing and learning after years of effort, and the investment of one of the world's most powerful streaming companies. It was delivered in the $4 million cost of a tour that generated a fraction of that in income, and it was delivered in the quiet but unmistakable shift in coverage from outlets like the Daily Mail, outlets that had every legal and commercial reason to avoid the subject, finally beginning to say, in measured but clear language, what those who had been watching most closely had been saying for a very long time, that the gap between the story being told and the reality being lived had become too wide, too visible, and too consequential to ignore any longer. The walls were not falling all at once, but they were falling, and the sound they made as they fell was the sound of a narrative meeting its moment of truth.